A lonely man entered an abandoned warehouse in search of scrap metal, but what he found there changed his life forever. Subscribe to the channel now and write in the comments where you are watching this story from. The day always began the same way for him. A dim gray light filtered through the thin curtains of the small rented room, casting a pallor over the cracked plaster walls and the sagging mattress that served as his bed. He would lie there for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling that bore stains from old leaks, listening to the distant groan of trucks rolling along the highway. His body no longer woke with energy, but rather with the heaviness of habit, the awareness that another day had arrived whether he wanted it or not. There was no reason to rise early, no pressing appointment, no job waiting for him, yet staying in bed felt like surrender. And so he would push himself upright, the bones in his knees protesting, the chill of the unheated room clinging to his skin. The man had once been strong, the kind of worker whose broad shoulders could carry the weight of machinery and whose calloused hands could twist a wrench with precision. Years spent at the factory had carved that strength into him, and for a time he thought it would never leave. But factories close, machines fall silent, and a lifetime of labor can be erased with a single notice pinned to a locked gate. He remembered the day they shut it all down, the line of men standing outside with nowhere to go, their breath visible in the cold morning air, their faces set in disbelief. That day had stripped him not only of his wages, but of his identity. For decades he had been someone who belonged somewhere, someone with a purpose, and suddenly he was just another man on the margins. Now his life was measured in small acts of survival. His room, barely more than a box, smelled of dampness and dust. The wallpaper had peeled away in curling strips, revealing the bare wall beneath. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, its glow too weak to fully chase away the shadows. On the table stood a kettle blackened from years of use, a chipped mug, and a tin of instant coffee that he stretched as far as possible. Meals were simple and repetitive. Bread hardening at the edges, canned beans, instant noodles, whatever he could afford, with the few coins earned from odd jobs or the occasional load of scrap metal carried to the recycling yard. His clothing reflected the erosion of time. The jacket he wore each day had frayed cuffs and a tear along one seam that he had never mended. His boots were cracked along the sides, the soles thin enough that he could feel the gravel beneath them. He remembered buying them years ago, proud of their durability, convinced they would last forever. Now they were like him, worn and tired, still functional but far from what they had once been. He would sometimes glance at his reflection in the window glass at night, the dim light outlining the lines of his face, and wonder when exactly he had become old. Each day resembled the last, so much so that time blurred. He woke, he wandered, he searched for scraps of metal or small jobs that would yield a few bills. He was the kind of man others looked through, never directly at. Shopkeepers handed him change without making eye contact. Strangers passed him on sidewalks as though he were part of the scenery. He had grown used to invisibility, but deep down, somewhere beneath the layers of resignation, a faint ache remained. Once he had mattered, once he had stood shoulder to shoulder with others who depended on him. Now he felt erased, as though even his own past doubted he had ever existed. Memories haunted him when the nights grew long. He thought of the factory floor, the thunder of machines, the rhythm of labor that had filled his ears each day. He could almost smell the oil in the steel shavings, feel the weight of the wrench in his hand. There had been camaraderie there, crude jokes shared during breaks, nods of respect for a job done well. Those men were scattered now, gone to other towns, some buried in the cold ground. He had not kept in touch with any of them, and when he allowed himself to think about it, he realized he would have no one to call if he found a phone in his hand. The silence of his room each evening was a sharp contrast to the noise of his remembered past, and the quiet pressed on him like a weight. There had been a family once too, though he rarely permitted himself to think of them. The marriage had not survived the years of layoffs and bills, the endless tension of scraping by. His wife had left, taking with her what remained of warmth and laughter in his life. And though at first he had raged against it, eventually even anger had drained away. Now all that remained was a vague recollection of faces and voices he no longer heard. Time had thinned those memories until they felt like dreams. Sometimes he asked himself if they had ever been real or if his mind invented them to ease the sting of solitude. As he shuffled through his days, he moved without urgency. There was no destination, only movement for its own sake. He roamed alleyways, peered into empty lots, and searched abandoned corners of the city for discarded metal that could be sold. His arms still had strength for carrying, though less than before. And each time he lugged a sack of rusted scraps to the recycler, he wondered how many more years his back would endure. The coins he received never stretched far. By nightfall, he would be back in his room, staring at the ceiling again, listening to the hum of the city beyond his thin walls, and waiting for sleep to pull him into darkness. The loneliness was not loud, it did not roar. It crept quietly, settling in the cracks of his days. He no longer expected a knock at the door, a phone call, or a letter. Weeks could pass without him speaking more than a few words to anyone, and his voice grew hoarse when he finally used it. Sometimes he caught himself whispering to the kettle as it boiled, as if to prove he still existed. The thought that he might vanish one day without anyone noticing filled him with a kind of numb despair. But even that despair had dulled over the years. It was simply the air he breathed, the background hum of a life lived on the sidelines. And yet, despite the gray sameness, despite the silence and the emptiness, there remained something stubborn inside him, a flicker, faint but persistent. It stirred when he remembered the pride of a completed task, the satisfaction of hands creating something useful. It whispered when he passed the skeletons of old buildings, the echoes of industry lingering in their rusted beams. It was not hope exactly, but it was not nothing either. It was the barest suggestion that life could still change, that he had not reached the final chapter of his story. On certain mornings, when the sun broke through the clouds and lit the cracked pavement with unexpected warmth, he would feel it more strongly. He would pause in his wandering and lift his eyes to the light, and for a heartbeat the heaviness inside him would ease. He would imagine a different kind of day, one where he discovered something worth keeping, something that gave him reason to continue. He never knew what that something might be, only that he longed for it, even as he told himself he had stopped longing for anything. As evening fell on this particular day, he sat on the edge of his bed and rubbed his aching hands together. The skin was rough, the knuckles scarred, the veins rising like ridges beneath the surface. These were the hands of a man who had once been strong, who had once built and repaired, who had once held tools with confidence. He looked at them and wondered if they could still create, if they could still serve a purpose beyond carrying bags of scrap. He pushed the thought away, ashamed of the weakness it suggested, but it lingered nonetheless. Outside his window, the city lights flickered on one by one. The glow reached into his room, illuminating the dust floating in the air. He leaned back against the wall and listened to the faint rumble of trains on the distant tracks. He knew he would rise again tomorrow and repeat the same weary routine. But somewhere deep inside, the flicker burned a little brighter, fed by something he could not name. Perhaps it was only the stubbornness of a man who refused to accept that this was all his life would ever be. Or perhaps it was the first whisper of change, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. That night, as he drifted into uneasy sleep, he dreamed of rusted metal and darkened halls, of a place where forgotten things waited in silence. He did not yet know that this dream was not far from reality, that soon his wandering would lead him to a place long abandoned, a place where the echoes of another man's life still lingered. And when he found it, the course of his own existence, so long stuck in repetition, would begin to shift. Morning came again with its familiar gray light, and the man rose as he always did, slow and stiff, his movements dictated more by routine than by any true need to hurry. He drank the last of the bitter coffee from his chipped mug, chewed a corner of stale bread, and sat for a while staring at the floorboards. His chest ached with the dull weight of repetition, of knowing that today would be nearly indistinguishable from yesterday. Yet somewhere deep inside, the restlessness from the night before lingered. He remembered the dream of rusted metal and shadowed spaces, and though he told himself dreams were nothing but fragments of exhaustion, there was a peculiar pull in his chest, as if he were being summoned toward something waiting for him. He left his small room and stepped into the morning chill. The street smelled faintly of smoke and damp concrete, and the world moved around him without notice. People passed by carrying bags or hurrying toward buses, their eyes fixed on their own lives, blind to the solitary figure making his way toward the outskirts. He had no destination in mind at first, only the habit of walking where the forgotten things lay. Scrap metal was his livelihood, the only trade he had left. And though the returns were meager, the act of searching gave his feet a purpose. His path led him toward the industrial zone that had long since been abandoned by the companies that built it. The further he walked, the fewer people he saw. Sidewalks cracked and broken gave way to dirt paths scattered with glass and weeds. The hum of traffic dulled into silence, replaced by the whistle of wind through hollow structures. He passed the shells of factories with gaping windows like empty eyes, walls scarred with graffiti, doors rusted shut. Nature had begun reclaiming these ruins. Saplings grew from cracked foundations, ivy climbed the walls, and in some places entire trees had sprouted through the concrete floors. Yet the air still carried the faint memory of oil and smoke, as if the ghosts of machines still lingered in the shadows. He had been here before, many times. He knew where the copper wires could be pulled from crumbling walls, where rusted sheets of iron could be pried loose. But this morning his steps were slower, less driven by necessity, more drawn by a quiet curiosity he could not quite explain. It was as if the dream had nudged him in this direction, towards some corner he had not yet explored. He passed through tall grass that brushed against his knees, his boots crunching on broken glass, until he reached the edge of a wide yard where freight cars once stood waiting to be loaded. Now the tracks were twisted with rust, the yard filled with silence. Beyond the yard stood the warehouse. He had noticed it before, of course, a hulking structure at the far end of the lot, its corrugated walls streaked orange and brown with years of rain. The roof sagged in places, and the massive sliding doors hung crooked on their rails. He had always walked past it, preferring to search the smaller, safer ruins nearby. Something about the sheer emptiness of the building had unsettled him, its gaping darkness like a mouth prepared to swallow intruders. But today he slowed, his eyes fixed on its hollow silhouette. The warehouse seemed to wait, patient and indifferent, daring him to cross the open ground that separated them. The air smelled stronger here, a pungent mix of rust, wet soil, and forgotten time. He approached cautiously, his footsteps echoing against the stillness, until he reached the doors. One was partially open, tilted on its rusted hinges, leaving a gap wide enough for a man to slip through. He hesitated, staring at the shadowed interior, and felt the familiar tug of caution. Old buildings could be dangerous. Roofs could collapse. Floors could give way. People sometimes use such places for hiding things better, left undisturbed. Yet behind his hesitation was a spark of something else, a sense that this was the place from his dream, the place where forgotten things whispered. He stepped inside, the darkness swallowing him for a moment before his eyes adjusted. The air was heavy with the smell of damp iron and old wood. Water dripped steadily from the broken roof into shallow pools that reflected the dim light filtering through holes above. Dust hung in the air, disturbed by his presence, shimmering faintly in the pale shafts of sun. The cavernous space stretched out before him, rows of skeletal shelves lining the walls, crates scattered across the cracked floor. In the silence, even the sound of his own breathing seemed too loud. He moved slowly, his boots splashing in shallow puddles, his eyes scanning the room. There was scrap here, yes, but something about the arrangement of the space drew him deeper. In one corner, half hidden by collapsed beams, stood a cluster of wooden boxes stacked haphazardly. They were stained with rust, their surfaces rough with age, but unlike the piles of useless debris elsewhere, these boxes seemed deliberately placed, as though someone had once left them here with care. The man paused, listening. The warehouse was silent save for the steady drip of water and the faint rustle of wind through broken windows. No one else was here. He approached the boxes and ran his hand over one lid, feeling the grain of the wood beneath the layer of grime. The sensation stirred something inside him, a recognition he could not explain. He bent and pushed aside debris until he could see the markings on one crate. Faint letters burned into the wood, the edges worn away by time. The letters were not clear, but the care with which they had been made was unmistakable. His heart beat faster, though he did not know why. To him, warehouses were places of rust and waste, not of mystery. Yet standing there in the dim light, staring at the forgotten crates, he felt an uncanny sense that he was trespassing, not in a ruin, but in someone's memory. He had come searching for scrap metal, something to sell for coins, but instead he had found silence heavy with meaning. He crouched and pressed his hand to the cool floor, his reflection wavering in the thin film of water. He thought of his own life, the endless repetition, the feeling of erasure. And here was a place that had been erased too, once alive with labor, now silent and abandoned. He felt a kinship with the warehouse itself, as if it too had been cast aside when its usefulness was deemed spent. And yet, just like him, it still stood, scarred and empty but enduring, waiting for something to stir its silence. The man straightened and looked around again. The expanse of the warehouse stretched before him, shadows shifting as the light from the broken roof beams shifted with the passing clouds. He knew he should leave, that nothing good ever came from lingering in forgotten places. But his feet would not carry him back toward the door. Something urged him deeper into the building, toward the boxes, toward the possibility of finding not just scraps of metal, but something more. He did not know what, but for the first time in years he felt the pull of curiosity stronger than the weight of despair. As he placed his hand once more on the rough wood of the nearest crate, a shiver ran through him. The sound of dripping water echoed like a heartbeat in the cavernous space, steady and patient. He realized he had crossed an invisible threshold, that the life he had known until now, the endless repetition of hunger and fatigue, had been left outside the door with the morning light. Within this warehouse, among these crates and shadows, waited something different. He could not yet name it, but he knew he would return tomorrow and the day after, until he uncovered what had been left here. He turned to leave, stepping back through the doorway into the pale afternoon, the smell of rust clinging to his clothes. Behind him the warehouse loomed, silent and waiting, a dark figure against the horizon. He felt its presence even as he walked away, its shadow stretching across his thoughts. He had entered a place of endings, yet what he carried with him was the faint but undeniable sense of a beginning. The following day arrived with the same gray light, but the man felt a difference within himself. It was not excitement exactly, not the eager anticipation of a child awaiting a holiday, but rather a steady pull, a quiet compulsion that guided his steps before he had even decided where to go. He moved through the morning as if in a haze, drinking the bitter coffee that had grown weaker with each use of the same spoonful of powder, chewing stale bread that stuck to his teeth, and staring for a long moment at the cracked window pane. Outside, the sky was heavy with clouds, the kind of clouds that pressed low and made the air damp and cold. Yet despite the gloom, his body urged him out the door, across the streets, and back toward the edges of the city, where silence ruled among the ruins. His boots carried him over the broken sidewalks and into the forgotten industrial quarter once more. He passed familiar corners, graffiti-smeared walls, weeds clawing their way through cracked pavement, and he felt a strange comfort in returning here. Yesterday he had walked into the warehouse for the first time, had touched the forgotten crates, had felt the weight of something left behind. Today he knew he could not remain a bystander. There had been something about the place that clung to him as he slept, filling his dreams with echoes of dripping water and beams of light filtering through rusted holes. He had to see more, to know what lay hidden beneath the dust and rot. The warehouse loomed into view once again, its massive doors still crooked, its corrugated walls streaked with rust like old scars. He paused before stepping inside, the silence pressing on him, the cold wind pushing at his back. For a brief moment he wondered if this was madness, to wander alone into a place so forgotten, to risk collapsing beams and crumbling floors for the chance of discovering nothing at all. But the thought faded as quickly as it came. The emptiness of his life outside was more dangerous than any roof beam. Here at least there was the promise of something different. He slipped through the gap in the doors, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. The same smell met him: rust, dust, and damp wood. The dripping of water echoed faintly, steady as a metronome. He moved across the cracked floor, past the skeletal shelves and scattered debris, toward the corner where the crates stood. The air felt heavier here, as though it remembered everything that had been left within these walls. He knelt before the nearest box and brushed his hand across its lid, scattering dust that rose like smoke. The grain of the wood was rough beneath his fingertips, the edges softened by years of neglect. He pressed his weight against it, and the lid gave slightly, the rusted nails squealing in protest. With a grunt, he pried it open. Inside was not the worthless junk he had expected. Beneath a layer of yellowed cloth lay stacks of notebooks, their covers worn but intact. He lifted one carefully as though it might crumble, and blew away the dust. The pages inside were filled with lines of handwriting, precise, careful, deliberate. The ink had faded, but the words were still clear enough to read. His eyes moved over them slowly, at first with hesitation, then with a growing intensity. They were notes, technical in some places, describing measurements and sketches of mechanical parts. But interspersed with these were words more personal, fragments of thought that belonged not to an engineer, but to a man trying to make sense of his own existence. He turned the pages, his heart beating faster. Here was someone who had once stood in the same space, who had written these lines with a steady hand and a restless mind. The writer spoke of machines that might make work easier, of designs to reduce waste, of tools that could be built from discarded parts. But then, in the margins, the words shifted into confessions. "The nights are long," one entry read, "and the silence presses on me. I wonder if my work will matter when I'm gone, or if it will rot in the dark with me." Mena. The man swallowed, the words striking too close. He set the notebook down carefully and pulled another from the box. This one contained sketches of strange devices, intricate and detailed, some clearly incomplete. Others were accompanied by notes describing how they had failed, what went wrong, what needed to change. Each page bore the weight of persistence, of someone who refused to stop trying. He sat there for what felt like hours, his knees aching against the hard floor, his fingers blackened by dust. Around him the warehouse remained silent, indifferent, but within him something stirred. These were not the empty relics of a forgotten building. They were the traces of a mind that had refused to surrender, a voice that still spoke long after its owner was gone. He had expected rusted nails and worthless scrap. Instead, he had found words that mirrored his own loneliness, his own quiet despair, and his own unspoken hope that maybe life could still mean something. When at last he set the notebooks back into the crate, he noticed other objects beneath them. Wrapped in brittle brown paper were small tools, the kind an engineer might use for delicate work. A pair of calipers, tarnished but intact. A magnifying glass with its handle worn smooth. Even a set of drafting instruments, their brass edges dulled but still serviceable. He lifted them one by one, feeling their weight, and it struck him that these tools had been waiting here, untouched, as if left behind for someone who might need them. He felt a strange ownership as he held them, though he knew they had never been his. Another crate revealed stacks of loose papers bound with twine. He untied one bundle and found letters, written in the same careful hand. They were not addressed to anyone. Instead, they seemed like messages written to the air, thoughts poured onto paper with no expectation of reply. "If anyone ever finds this," one began, "know that I tried. I tried to build something that mattered. I tried to fill the silence with work, to give shape to the emptiness. Maybe it was foolish, but it was all I had." The man's throat tightened as he read. He felt as though the writer was speaking directly to him across the years, reminding him that solitude did not mean worthlessness. He placed the letters back and sat for a long time in silence, the weight of discovery pressing on him. The warehouse no longer seemed merely abandoned. It was alive in its own way, filled with the lingering presence of someone who had refused to vanish quietly. He thought about how he had been living, drifting through days with no purpose, no mark left behind. The notebooks, the sketches, the tools. These were proof that a man could be forgotten by the world and yet still leave something of himself, something that endured. The light through the broken roof shifted as the day waned, and he knew he could not stay much longer. He closed the crates gently, covering the notebooks and tools once more, as if tucking them back into sleep. He rose slowly, his knees stiff, his body weary, but his mind alive in a way it had not been for years. He glanced around the vast, shadowed space and felt that he had stepped into the remnants of another life, one that somehow reflected his own. As he left the warehouse and stepped into the fading afternoon, the air outside felt different. The city's noise seemed distant, the sky darker, the wind colder, yet within him was a small spark of warmth. He had not only found objects, he had found a voice, a presence, a reminder that even in solitude, meaning could be carved from the silence. He walked back toward his room with the weight of dust still on his hands and the memory of those words echoing in his mind. That night, as he lay in his bed staring at the ceiling once again, the familiar heaviness of his life did not feel quite as absolute. The dreamlike pull that had drawn him to the warehouse now felt like a thread connecting him to something larger than himself. He had discovered the first traces of a forgotten man's struggle, and, in them, a reflection of his own. He knew he would return. There was more to uncover, more to read, more to understand. The warehouse had not revealed everything yet. It had only opened its doors and shown him the first fragments. The rest waited in silence, waiting for him to listen. The man could not sleep well after that second visit to the warehouse. He lay on his narrow mattress, staring at the cracked ceiling as though it might offer answers, the words from those notebooks echoing in his mind. They would not let him rest. Phrases written decades earlier pressed against his thoughts, their ink faded, but their weight sharp and insistent. If anyone ever finds this, know that I tried. That line in particular looped in his head until dawn began to lighten the filthy curtains of his room. He rose weary but restless, his heart beating with a strange urgency, as though he were carrying someone else's unfinished task upon his shoulders. He walked again to the warehouse, drawn by an invisible thread. The streets felt emptier than usual, the air heavy with the smell of rain that had yet to fall. He kept his hands in his jacket pockets, his head bent, moving with the purposeful gait of a man who had decided that whatever lay waiting in that building was now part of his life. He no longer thought of searching for scrap metal to sell. The few coins he might earn seemed pitiful when weighed against the gravity of the discovery he had made. Scrap fed the body for a day, but the words he had uncovered fed something deeper, something he had thought long dead. The hulking silhouette of the warehouse appeared, rising like a monument to abandonment at the edge of the city. Its rusted panels gleamed faintly with moisture from the mist that clung to everything, and the crooked doors gaped as though they had been expecting him. He slipped inside and was greeted by the familiar silence, the steady dripping of water echoing like a clock that measured not hours but years. Dust hung in the shafts of dim light, swirling slowly with each of his movements. He went straight to the crates. His hands trembled as he pried one further open, as though he feared what new weight the words within might add to his chest. More notebooks lay stacked beneath those he had already seen, and beneath them were bundles of letters tied together with twine so brittle it crumbled at his touch. He lifted one carefully, the paper dry and fragile, and untied the knot. Inside were dozens of folded sheets, each covered with that same steady handwriting. But these were not notes about machines or sketches of tools. These were letters addressed, though never sent, to someone. The first name written at the top of the page was Anna. His breath caught as he read. The words spoke not of work or inventions, but of longing. Anna, the nights are colder without you. I keep the lamp burning, though there is no one here to see it but me. Sometimes I talk to the walls, as though they might carry my voice to you. The man swallowed hard, the ache in the words reaching across the years. He turned the page and found another. I imagine you walking through that door. I imagine your footsteps echoing in this place. I imagine your voice breaking the silence. Each letter was a fragment of solitude poured onto paper, a testimony to a love lost or perhaps abandoned, preserved only in ink and dust. The man sat on the damp floor, his back against the crate, and read until his eyes blurred. He did not know who Anna had been or why the writer of these letters had remained in this hollow place, but he felt the presence of that unknown man more strongly with each word. It was as though the writer had left his soul pressed into the fibers of the paper, waiting for another lonely soul to arrive decades later and hear him. And in the act of reading, the man felt less alone himself. For the first time in years, the silence of his own life seemed to contain another voice. Beneath the letters he found a leather-bound journal, its cover stiff with age. He opened it and discovered something different still. A diary, each entry dated, stretching across years. The first pages were filled with determination. The writer described arriving at the warehouse when it was still alive, when the machines still roared and men shouted across the floor. He wrote of the pride of creating, of fixing broken engines, of sketching ideas late into the night. But as the pages turned, the tone shifted. The entries grew shorter, bleaker. The men are gone. The machines are silent. I remain because I do not know where else to go. Later entries carried the weight of resignation. I am the only witness now. If I leave, the last light will go out. The man closed the journal and held it against his chest, his heart pounding. He felt as though he were intruding on something sacred, not just pages, but the remnant of a life poured out in words. He thought of his own life, of the silence of his room, of the absence of anyone to write to. If he had begun such a journal, what would his words have been? Perhaps nothing but empty confessions of hunger, of weariness, of drifting. Yet here was a man who had transformed his solitude into testimony, who had refused to vanish without leaving behind his voice. He rose and walked deeper into the warehouse, clutching the journal. The vast emptiness seemed less threatening now, more like a cathedral where the prayers of the forgotten still lingered. He noticed for the first time a desk shoved against the far wall, covered in dust and rusted tools. Papers were scattered across it, protected beneath a warped sheet of glass. He brushed the dirt away and revealed more sketches, blueprints for machines that looked fantastical, almost impossible, drawn with meticulous care. In the corner of one page, the writer had scrawled, "For those who come after me, build if you can, continue if you dare." The man stood frozen, staring at the words until they blurred. For those who come after me. Was that meant for him? He shook his head, ashamed of the thought. He was no builder now, no craftsman. He was a man who collected scraps to keep himself fed. And yet he could not deny the pull in his chest, the whisper that perhaps he had stumbled into this place not by accident, but by some strange design. He pressed his hand flat against the desk, feeling the rough paper beneath the glass, and let the silence settle around him like a cloak. When at last he left the warehouse, the sky had darkened with rain clouds. Drops began to fall as he walked back through the empty yard, soaking his thin jacket. But he felt none of the usual weight of despair. Instead, he carried the words with him, the voice of a man long gone, yet still present, still speaking through the fragments left behind. The rain washed the dust from his hands, but it could not wash away the echo of that voice in his mind. That night he sat in his small room, the journal resting on the table before him. He had carried it out of the warehouse without thinking, unable to leave it behind. The leather cover glistened faintly in the dim light. He opened it again and read by the weak glow of the bulb, his fingers trembling as he traced the lines of ink. Each word felt like a bridge across time, connecting him not just to the writer, but to the possibility that even in loneliness, meaning could be preserved. As the hours passed, he realized something had changed within him. He was no longer drifting without anchor. He was no longer only surviving. He had been given a task, though he could not yet define it. The warehouse, with its crates and notebooks and letters, had entrusted him with a voice from the past. And for the first time in years, he felt as though he had been chosen for something, even if that something was nothing more than remembering a man who had refused to be forgotten. The rain tapped steadily against the window, and the city hummed in the distance. But the man no longer heard only the emptiness. He heard another voice layered upon his own silence, a voice that whispered across our decades. It told him that his life, too, might yet hold more than drifting and despair. He closed the journal, placed it carefully on the table, and leaned back against the wall. His eyes closed, but sleep did not come easily. The voice lingered, filling the cracks of his solitude, promising that tomorrow he would return again to the warehouse, not as a scavenger, but as a listener. The next morning began in much the same way as every other had, yet to the man it felt entirely different. He awoke before the dim light crept through the threadbare curtains of his rented room, his eyes opening as if summoned. The journal lay on the table beside his bed, where he had placed it the night before, and the sight of it pulled him upright. He reached for it with the reverence of a man handling a relic, running his fingers across the cracked leather cover. His chest tightened at the thought of returning it to the warehouse. But the stronger pull was the knowledge that there was more waiting for him there, more pages and voices hidden in the dust. He felt almost as though he had been given a duty, an inheritance of memory that he could not ignore. He left the room quickly, his steps brisk despite the weight of fatigue in his limbs. The streets were damp, washed clean by the night's rain, and the smell of wet asphalt clung to the air. He walked without hesitation, no longer moving with the sluggishness of habit but with the certainty of purpose. The industrial district was as silent as ever, its crumbling walls bearing witness to decades of neglect. But to him it no longer felt entirely dead. Somewhere inside the rusted skin of that warehouse, a man's voice still lingered, and he was determined to hear more of it. When he entered, the familiar darkness and damp greeted him like an old companion. The dripping of water echoed faintly, but this time it did not sound like decay. It sounded like rhythm, like a steady heartbeat that had kept the warehouse alive long after everyone else had forgotten it. He moved deeper into the space, his eyes finding the desk, the crates, the scattered tools that had become his sanctuary. He set the journal carefully back in its place, as though returning it to its rightful home, and then turned to explore further. He began to tidy without consciously deciding to. His hands reached for fallen scraps of wood, rusted nails, shards of glass, gathering them into piles as if to make the place livable again. Dust coated his palms, streaked his jacket, clung to his hair, but he felt none of the disgust that usually came with filth. Instead, every movement brought a strange satisfaction. The act of order gave him control, as though by restoring this forgotten place, he might also restore something inside himself. When the floor was cleared enough for him to move freely, he found a lamp, its metal frame bent but intact, and set it upright on the desk. The bulb inside was long dead, but he imagined what it might look like if lit again, casting its glow across the drawings and journals. He remembered the letter that had spoken of keeping a lamp burning for Anna, a futile act of faith in the face of solitude. The thought made him smile sadly. Perhaps he too could light something here, not only for himself but for the man whose words still lived in these walls. He ventured deeper into the warehouse, into corners he had not yet examined. More crates waited, their lids warped but still holding secrets. He pried one open and found a collection of small metal parts, each labeled in handwriting that matched the notebooks. There were gears, bolts, screws, pieces of half-built mechanisms that spoke of endless hours of labor. He lifted one, a brass gear tarnished green with age, and held it to the light. It was heavy in his palm, yet the care with which it had been crafted made it seem almost delicate. He realized with a pang that these were not just remnants of work. They were fragments of hope, each piece the beginning of something the engineer had wanted to build. The man's pulse quickened. He carried the parts back to the desk and began arranging them, unsure of what he was doing, but compelled nonetheless. He laid out the gears side by side, aligned the bolts, spread the papers across the surface until the desk no longer looked abandoned, but alive with possibility. His hands moved with a steadiness he had not felt in years, guided by an instinct buried deep within him. He remembered the factories of his youth, the machines that roared with relentless rhythm, and the pride he had once felt in working among them. That pride had long been buried under failure and loneliness, but now, here, it began to stir again. Hours passed unnoticed. Dust swirled in the slanting beams of light, and the air grew colder, but he did not leave. He read more of the journals, following the voice of the man who had lived here. Each entry deepened the connection, weaving threads between their lives. The engineer had written of long nights spent tinkering, of failures that piled higher than successes, of the crushing silence that only work could push back. And yet, even in despair, there had been persistence. "To stop is to vanish," one entry read, "and I refuse to vanish." The man felt those words echo through him, striking chords he thought long silent. For years he had lived as if already vanished, drifting unseen through the streets. surviving but never existing. Now he saw a path, faint but visible, carved by the stubborn hand of someone who had refused to give in to nothingness. He realized that he too could choose to refuse. As the light outside shifted toward dusk, he struck a match and lit a small fire in a metal barrel he had dragged near the desk. The flames licked upward, casting a wavering glow across the walls, and the warehouse seemed to breathe. Shadows danced across the beams, making the space feel larger, alive. He sat before the fire, the warmth easing his stiff fingers, and stared at the desk he had brought back to order. For the first time in years, he felt as though he had created something, however small, that mattered. That night when he finally left, the world outside seemed less hostile. The streets were still broken, the air still damp, but he walked with straighter shoulders. The journals were not just relics of the past anymore. They had become guides, whispering that purpose could be carved from even the bleakest of lives. He understood now why he kept returning. The warehouse was no longer only a place of abandonment. It had become a mirror, reflecting not only what had been lost, but what could still be regained. Back in his room, he lay awake staring at the journal he had taken again. He thought about the hands that had written those words, hands rough with labor, but steady with conviction. He imagined the man alone in the warehouse decades ago, scribbling by lamplight, and he felt less like a scavenger and more like a successor. The silence of his room no longer felt empty. It felt full of echoes, of promises, of a voice that would not let him forget. He closed his eyes, exhaustion finally pulling him under, and for the first time in years, he dreamed not of absence, but of creation. He saw himself at the desk, the lamp burning bright, his hands steady over blueprints and tools. And in the dream, he was not alone. The following days passed in a haze of movement between his room and the warehouse, until the line dividing the two began to blur in his mind. His rented space was nothing more than a place to sleep, a narrow shell where he shut his eyes and endured the darkness. The warehouse, however, was alive. Each visit revealed something new. Each page he turned in the journals offered another glimpse into a life that had once filled those hollow walls. He no longer walked through the city as a man scavenging for scraps. He walked as a man returning to a place where he felt summoned, where the voice of the past whispered just loudly enough to keep him tethered. On a gray morning heavy with the promise of rain, he reached the warehouse earlier than usual. The air was damp and chill, clinging to his skin like a second garment, but his steps were brisk. He slipped inside the gaping doors and paused, listening to the silence. It was a silence he had grown familiar with, but this time it felt charged, as if the space itself were waiting for him. He lit a small fire in the barrel by the desk, the flames sending shadows leaping along the rusted beams, and sat down among the scattered crates. His hands trembled slightly as he pulled another journal from the bottom of a stack. This one was older than the others, its cover cracked, its pages yellowed, and when he opened it, the handwriting was less steady, almost rushed. He read carefully, his lips moving silently with the words. These entries were different. They did not describe machines or sketches of inventions, nor were they letters written to Anna. These pages spoke of secrets, of things left unspoken outside those walls. The man who had written them, whose presence the wanderer now felt as keenly as if he had been in the room, had not only been an engineer, he had also been a witness. The entries describe meetings held in the warehouse long after the factory had closed, men gathering in the dark, speaking in hushed voices, carrying crates not of tools but of papers and ledgers. The writer confessed his confusion and fear. He had remained behind when everyone else left, but what he had seen in those nights troubled him deeply. He hinted at money exchanged in envelopes, at documents hidden beneath floorboards, at the sound of arguments that ended abruptly when footsteps approached. The man set the journal down and rubbed his eyes, his pulse quickening. Until now, the voice of the engineer had been a companion, a fellow sufferer of solitude. Now it became something else entirely, the voice of a witness to secrets buried deeper than dust. He turned the page and continued reading, his breath shallow. The entries grew more fragmented, the words sharp with unease. I hear them again tonight. They think I am asleep, but I watch from the shadows. They hide something beneath the third beam by the west wall. I do not know what it is, but I feel the weight of danger in the air. Another page bore only a single sentence, scrawled hastily. If I disappear, the truth is hidden here. The man froze. His gaze swept instinctively toward the far wall of the warehouse, where rusted beams stretched upward like the ribs of a carcass. He rose, his legs unsteady, and walked across the floor. His boots echoed faintly on the cracked concrete as he reached the west wall. He pressed his palm against the cold metal beam, the chill seeping into his skin. The journal had mentioned the third beam. He counted carefully, his breath shallow, until he stood before it. The metal was streaked with rust, its surface pitted and rough, but he saw nothing unusual at first glance. He crouched and ran his hand along its base, feeling for anything out of place, and his fingers brushed against something hollow. A shiver ran through him. He knelt lower, pushing aside dirt and fragments of wood, until his hand struck something that gave beneath his touch. His pulse thundered in his ears as he pried at it, until a section of the floor shifted and lifted with a reluctant creak. Beneath the broken planks was a cavity no larger than a suitcase, lined with damp earth and dust. Inside lay a metal box, its lid sealed with rusted glass. He pulled it free with both hands, grunting as the weight of it strained his arms and carried it to the desk. For a long moment he simply stared at it, his breath uneven. The fire crackled softly nearby, casting flickering light across the metal surface. He reached for the clasp and pulled. They resisted, groaning in protest, but finally snapped open. The lid lifted slowly, and the smell of old paper and iron wafted out. Inside were bundles of documents wrapped in oilcloth, still intact despite the years. He unwrapped one with trembling hands and spread the pages across the desk. What he saw was not the personal musings of a lonely man. These were ledgers, records of transactions that made no sense to him at first glance. Names, numbers, dates, lists of materials bought and sold, quantities that seemed far beyond the needs of any factory. Some entries were underlined, others marked with symbols. The handwriting here was not the engineer's, but a collection of different hands, some neat, some hurried, all deliberate. He flipped through page after page, his eyes scanning the columns. He did not understand their meaning fully, but he sensed their weight. These papers had been hidden for a reason. At the bottom of the box, he found something else, a bundle of photographs. He held them to the firelight, squinting at the faded images. They showed men standing outside the warehouse, their faces shadowed but their postures tense. Another showed crates being carried inside. In the margins, the engineer had written in his careful hand, "These are the men. This is what they brought." Some. The last photograph showed a man seated at the very desk where the wanderer now sat, his features half hidden by the angle, but his presence commanding. On the back was scrawled a single word, "Master." The man leaned back, his chest tight, his mind spun with questions. What had been happening here in those years after the factory's silence? Who were the men in the photographs, and what had they been hiding? Why had the engineer remained? Why had he written these confessions in secret? And what had become of him? He felt as though he had stumbled into a labyrinth of shadows, a history buried beneath rust and dust, waiting for someone, anyone, to uncover it. And now that someone was him. The fire burned lower, the shadows deepened, and he sat for hours, turning the papers over, reading the engineer's words again and again. He felt the loneliness of the man who had lived here, but also his fear, his determination to leave behind a record even if no one would believe it. The voice that had once been only a companion was now a guide, urging him deeper into a truth hidden for decades. When he finally rose to leave, the city outside felt altered. The warehouse was no longer simply a refuge from his own emptiness. It had become a vessel of secrets, a grave of stories half buried and waiting. He walked back through the streets with the weight of those papers heavy in his mind, his thoughts churning like the dark clouds above. He could not yet see where this path would lead, but he knew there was no turning back. The shadows of truth had taken hold of him, and they would not let him go. That night, as he lay awake in his narrow bed, the rain returned, tapping against the window like impatient fingers. He stared into the darkness. The photographs and journals burned into his memory. For the first time since he had found the warehouse, he felt not only curiosity, but responsibility. The engineer's voice had not only asked to be heard, it had asked to be remembered, to be carried forward, to ensure that the truth hidden in those crates and beams did not vanish with time. The man closed his eyes, but the darkness behind them was filled with images of ledgers, photographs, and the solemn face of a stranger long gone who had left behind the fragments of a story unfinished. And he understood, with a clarity that chilled him, that he had inherited not only the solitude of the warehouse, but its secrets as well. The night had not been kind to him. He had lain awake in his narrow bed, staring into the darkness as the rain rattled against the window pane, unable to silence the storm that now raged within him. The warehouse no longer occupied his thoughts as a place of refuge. It had become a vault of questions, a chest of ghosts rattling to be freed. He turned over again and again, his body weary but his mind aflame with images of the photographs, the ledgers, the engineer's trembling words. Every time his eyes drifted shut, he saw the flickering firelight casting shadows on the beams, and within those shadows loomed the figure of the man who had once guarded those secrets. When the first light of dawn finally crept across the ceiling, pale and uncertain, he rose without hesitation. Sleep had fled him, but in its place came a determination that felt heavier and sturdier than fatigue. The streets of the city were washed clean by the rain, gleaming wet and gray beneath the morning sky. He walked quickly, his coat clinging damply to his shoulders, his boots splashing through puddles, but he hardly noticed the chill. His thoughts pressed forward with every step, urging him back to the warehouse, back to the rusted walls that now seemed to hold the key to his own existence. He reached it with a quickening heart, the doors groaning as he pushed them open. The air inside was cold, still heavy with the scent of dampness and ash from the fire he had left the night before, but it greeted him now like the breath of something alive. The desk stood as he had left it, scattered with papers and photographs, the metal box still open, its contents waiting. He sat down and began once again to read. Each ledger spoke of transactions too large to be honest, shipments that passed unnoticed by the world, but had left their trace in ink. He understood little of the numbers, but the pattern was unmistakable. Money had flowed like a hidden river, and these walls had been its banks. The photographs, too, offered silent testimony. Men with guarded eyes and tense postures, crates carried under cover of darkness, meetings in the shadows where the engineer had hidden to watch. The man turned them over slowly, feeling as though the past itself were whispering against his fingertips. The more he read, the more he felt the weight of decision pressing upon him. He could walk away, let the secrets remain buried in rust and dust, pretend the warehouse was nothing more than an abandoned shell. Or he could step forward, carry the burden that the engineer had tried to preserve for so long. His life until now had been marked by absence of family, of purpose, of anything worth clinging to. But now, here in this forgotten corner of the city, something had been handed to him. It was not wealth nor glory, but a charge, a calling to finish what another man had begun. His eyes drifted across the journals, the meticulous handwriting that had first drawn him into this world. They no longer spoke only of loneliness and invention. They spoke of trust, of a desperate hope that someone, someday, might come and see. And he realized with a clarity that both frightened and steadied him that he was that someone, not by merit, not by choice, but by circumstance. The engineer's solitude had been broken by his discovery, and with it came the inheritance of duty. The days that followed were unlike any he had known in years. Each morning he returned to the warehouse, not as a scavenger seeking scraps, but as a caretaker, almost a steward. He cleared more of the floor, sweeping away years of dust, pushing aside debris that no longer felt like ruin, but like layers of silence he was peeling back. He found tools, some broken, some still usable, and cleaned them until their edges gleamed faintly in the light. He set up the desk properly, organizing the papers, placing the photographs in careful order, as though arranging the fragments of a life into a story that could finally be told. The work itself gave him purpose, but it was the sense of connection that kept him moving. He spoke aloud at times, reading the engineer's words into the echoing space, imagining the man listening, perhaps relieved that his voice had not been lost entirely. He began to repair small things, a lamp rewired, a chair strengthened with nails scavenged from broken boards, a hinge straightened until the door swung without protest. The warehouse, once a hollow tomb, began to shift under his touch, to resemble not merely an abandoned relic, but a place where life might return. Yet he could not ignore the truth that lingered in the ledgers. They gnawed at him, those lines of numbers and names, whispering of corruption, of crimes hidden away. At night he carried them in his mind back to his room, unable to forget. He wondered what right he had to expose them, or even to try. He was no man of law, no historian, no one who might understand fully the scale of what had happened here. And yet the idea of leaving them locked away again filled him with dread. To walk away would be to betray not only the engineer, but himself, for he had begun to see in those words the reflection of his own hunger for meaning. One evening, as the sun sank low and turned the rusted beams to bars of fire, he found a letter folded between the pages of a journal. It was addressed not to Anna, nor to himself, but simply, "To the one who finds this." His breath caught as he unfolded it, the paper fragile in his hands. The letter spoke in trembling lines of fear and hope. The engineer confessed that he had not the courage to bring the truth into the light himself, that his days were waning and his strength failing, but he believed someone might come after him. "If you are reading this," the letter said, "then I ask you only to remember that what was hidden here matters. Do not let it vanish. Do not let my silence be the end." The man sat for a long time, staring at the words until they blurred with the sting of his eyes. In that moment, he felt the weight of his decision settle upon him like a cloak. He would not abandon this. He would not let it fade into dust. He did not yet know how he would bring it forward, nor what dangers might come if he tried, but he knew with the certainty of bone and blood that he could no longer live as he had before. The engineer had given him more than papers and tools. He had given him a reason to rise each morning, a direction when his life had been nothing but circles. As the weeks turned, the warehouse transformed. The man kept working, driven not by necessity but by devotion. Where once he had been a shadow slipping unnoticed through the city, now he stood taller, his hands steady with labor, his mind lit with purpose. He brought light into the warehouse at night, rigging wires to power the old lamp so that the desk glowed warmly against the dark. He built shelves from scavenged wood to hold the journals, arranging them carefully so that the voice of the past would no longer lie scattered in neglect. The place that had once been nothing but ruin now held the shape of a workshop, a sanctuary, a home, and in the process, something within him shifted. He no longer felt the crushing solitude that had defined him for so many years. The engineer's voice was there, steady and insistent, reminding him with every word that lives could connect even across decades, that despair did not have to be the final word. He found himself speaking to the man as he worked, thanking him, asking questions, promising aloud that he would not let the story die. And though no answer came, the silence seemed less empty, as though the walls themselves had begun to listen. It was on a morning of startling clarity, when the air was sharp and the sky was swept clean of clouds, that he finally allowed himself to see the truth of what had happened. He stood at the threshold of the warehouse, the doors opened to the light, and looked inside at what he had created. No longer did it resemble a tomb. It was a place of memory, of labor, of hope. It was his. And for the first time in many years, he felt not like a man adrift, but like a man standing at the beginning of a path. He knew the questions would not vanish, that the secrets hidden in those ledgers might yet bring shadows upon him. But he also knew that walking away was no longer possible. The engineer had trusted a stranger, trusted time itself to deliver his story to someone willing to carry it. And now, that burden had become a gift. The man turned toward the city, the damp streets and broken buildings that had once seemed like a prison, and he saw them differently. They were not only ruins, they were places where stories had been buried, waiting for someone to unearth them. With the papers safe, the journals organized, and the fire of determination burning quietly in his chest, he stepped forward into his new life. He was no longer merely the scavenger who had stumbled into a forgotten warehouse. He was the keeper of its truth, the steward of a voice that had refused to vanish, and in carrying that voice, he had found his own. For the first time in years, he was not afraid of tomorrow. If this story kept you watching until the very end, don't forget to subscribe right now so you don't miss what's coming next. Tomorrow we've got another story that will shock you even more. Click on the next video waiting for you here on the screen, explore more of our unbelievable stories, and share this video with your friends. Let them be just as stunned as you are.